So let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Very happy to have you here. I'm Jack Petranker. I'm the director of the Mangalam Research Center for Buddhist Languages. And Mangalam Center has a program of occasional talks and other kinds of events. And as you can see, we reach out beyond the specific field of Buddhism. I will tell you that next week we're having a talk that is in the specific field of Buddhism. It'll be just a week from tonight. A professor from SOAS in England is going to be talking on, I don't remember the exact title, but it's on Tantra, the tantric, how can I say it? Why is it that some Theravadan meditation looks very tantric? That's what the talk is about. And this is something she's been pursuing. It's really interesting for people who are interested in that sort of thing. So I encourage you to come. We'll be having other talks throughout the spring, and we'll keep going. Mostly they're going to be about Buddhist topics, but we like to reach out. So let me introduce Tomer. I'm going to do that with the help of the notes I have. Tomer Persico is a visiting scholar here. He is normally in Tel Aviv at the Department for Comparative Religion at Tel Aviv University, and is a research fellow of the Shalom Hartman Institute, which I gather is located there as well as here. Is that how it works? So he's here partly as a fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute, also at the Center for Jewish Studies at the university here. You're doing so many different things all at once. I'm just going to read it to you. He's the Koret Visiting Assistant Professor of Jewish and Israel Studies at the Department of Near Eastern Studies. He's at the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. He's at the Center for Jewish Studies at UC Berkeley, and he's an Institute Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. So, busy. He also writes a blog, which I understand is the best-known blog on religion in Israel. It's in Hebrew, for those of you who can benefit from that. And he has published a book on the topic of tonight's talk, Jewish Meditative Tradition, or maybe I should say Jewish Meditative Traditions. As instructed, he's holding up the book, but it's in Hebrew.
Yeah.
Yes. But the talk will be in English. We're in luck. Okay, I think that's it. We are delighted to have you here, Tomer.
Great, thank you.
So Tomer will talk for a while, about 40 minutes. He's got a PowerPoint. Then we'll have a little bit of discussion. I will have a conversation with him, and then we'll throw it open to the public.
Great, thank you so much, Jack.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. And I want to talk about the Jewish meditative tradition, past and present. And as you might imagine, this is a very broad subject and very big, certainly compared to the time we have. So I'm going to give some highlights, really, of it. It's not even the best hits, but really highlights that I believe will give you a feeling of what's it about, what is Jewish meditation about, what's it around, and how it differs from other traditions of meditation, what's its main characteristics, etc. And of course, then I will talk with Jack and maybe further elaborate it. Now, talking about meditation, first of all, I want to define what we're talking about. Could you press the little thing? So, a very broad definition of meditation which I'm using is the initiated activity meant to induce change considered therapeutic or soteriological by the initiator. Soteriology is the art of redemption. So it's a redemptive change or therapeutic change. And this means basically that we're talking about a very broad range of practices. It can be sitting quietly with eyes closed, but it can be also dancing to the beat of the drum. it can be fasting, it can be also physical exercises. So it's a broad range, but this, I want to make it broad in order for as much of Jewish practices that are intended to bring about soteriological change to be included. So that's meditation. And usually, could you press again? In general, I'm talking, the change involves the suppression, elimination, or alternatively, the intensification of common cognitive characteristics or contents, such as imagination, emotion, discursive thinking, or sense of self. We are talking about cognitive change in principle, and either acceleration or intensification or diminishment, eradication of all sorts of content that we have in our psyche. Would be an image of the Buddha and an image of Moses. And you can imagine these images because the iconography is very typical. You know what I'm talking about. The Buddha sitting in meditation, eyes at least half closed, and contemplating. And Moses with the two planks, how do you call them? Tablets, thank you. Tablets that he is bringing down from the Mount of Sinai. I want to use this iconography to flesh out how different really the traditions are, and in order to understand that meditation, when we talk about Jewish meditation, we are really talking about quite a different thing than when we talk about Buddhist meditation. The meditation in Buddhist tradition is a central theme. The Buddha is depicted meditating. And meditation is all over Buddhist texts. Not all, of course, and I'm not saying that everybody practices meditation, but it's front and center. In the Jewish tradition, we're not talking about centrally a meditative tradition. Moses is bringing the tablets down in order to initiate a covenant between a people and a God, a special people and a special God. That's the idea. And this covenant includes a lot of laws, a lot of rules, and elaboration on rules, right? So if we are talking about Jewish meditation, we must understand that it is always a peripheral thing. It is never the central element of the tradition. It never takes center stage. And it is, because of that also, it is quite varied, quite multifaceted. Why? When you have the Buddhist tradition, and when you have meditation take such an important place, it's obvious that there is one central, let's say, tree trunk of the meditative practice, and then there's all sorts of branches branching out of the main trunk and giving different versions or developments for the main practice. And we know that the Buddha talked about meditation in a few sutras, and then we have different schools that are basically taking the basic idea into different directions. Now, in the Jewish tradition, there is no basic idea. There is no central idea of how meditation should look like. That means that in each generation, people who wanted to practice meditation did it basically out of their own development. Of course, they had some past ideas to work with. They had traditions to compare themselves towards, but generally they could do what they thought was right. So again, an important characteristic with Jewish meditation is that it is very varied. There are different branches, different techniques, really. Now, I'll give 4 basic, major characteristics of Jewish meditation. The first is that it is directed towards the upper worlds. In general, Jewish meditation is with your head up, speaking metaphorically, but sometimes also literally. You want to have a vision of the upper worlds. You want to hear an audio message from the upper worlds. You want to influence the upper worlds. You want to rectify the upper worlds. many things, and you are then directed upwards. A second major characteristic is that Jewish meditation deals a lot with the Hebrew language. The Hebrew language takes an important place in Jewish meditation. It is considered, of course, a holy tongue. It is the language in which the divine created reality. And since it is that, of course, it is very important and it is very useful. It can be utilized to do many things, including contact the divine. And a sub-characteristic there is that Jewish meditation uses a lot, has a lot of use for divine names. God is named quite a number of names, many actually. Some of them are more important, some of them are secret, and these names, if the Jewish mystic knows them, can be used not only to influence the divine, but also to go through a process yourself in order to reach the divine. A third characteristic is that Jewish meditation emphasizes theurgy and magic. What is theurgy? Theurgy is the art of influencing the divine. You are here, you want to change something with the divine. You want to rectify the divine. Sometimes you want it to benefit you, to bless you, to do anything along that. And that also connects to magic. Magic is a part of the Jewish mystical tradition in general. It's not, there's nothing dishonorable or lowly about utilizing magic. Of course, for good purposes, etc. Let's say to get some rain pouring on the desert if you need it. But it's there. So that's the third characteristic. And the fourth is, I would say, that Jewish meditation is not antinomian, meaning it's not against the law. It's not subversive of tradition. Many times we have an idea that mysticism subverts normative tradition. The mystic is a wild card. He can do whatever he wants, or he or she can defy the laws because they are above the laws, or they dictate the laws, or anything like that. That's not what we find in Jewish mysticism and meditation, except for a few really singular cases. Usually, even it's the opposite. Jewish mysticism and Jewish meditation enforce, strengthen the tradition and the law. So these are the four characteristics I wanted to lay out. Now, if we start searching for Jewish meditation in the Jewish tradition, and if we start chronologically from the Bible, we might look for people who meditated, let's say in the Bible. And if we do, we might think perhaps that the prophets meditated. The prophets, certainly in the eyes of modern researchers and even modern maybe spiritual seekers, had spiritual or mystical experiences, right? They had divine visions. In fact, quite elaborate visions, and they had auditory, also visions, messages coming to them. They must have practiced something. Now, two pictures, drawings of prophets, one of them of Jonah and one of the prophet Isaiah. Both don't seem very glad to be spoken to by the divine, by God. Jonah, as we know of the story, he wanted to escape. He wanted to run away and not receive the prophecy that God wanted him to, and to go to Nineveh, etc., to preach. Isaiah, when God first reveals himself to him, is terrified and is sure that he is going to die. And he says so. Certainly I'm going to die because I am defiled, etc., something. And then God needs to reassure him, don't worry about it. So basically, prophets seem pretty surprised if not downright terrified, when they have their revelation of the divine. It doesn't look like it was initiated. It doesn't look like they practiced anything in order to get there. So I would say that talk about the prophets being engaging in spiritual exercise is really not founded. But we do have, I would say, 2 instances of actual meditative techniques being talked about, being presented in the Bible. So I brought a quote from the first book of Samuel, chapter 10. Samuel there directs Saul, the first king of Israel. He directs him to go to a place he calls the Hill of God, where Saul will meet a group of prophets. That's what Samuel says. And this group of prophets are carrying musical instruments, drum and harp and flute. And he needs to prophesy with them. And Samuel promises Saul that when you do it, I will read, and the Spirit of the Lord will come upon thee, and thou shalt prophesy with them, and shall be turned into another man. He will be transformed by that prophecy that he will engage with that group of prophets. Now here we have, I would say, a clear example of a spiritual experience that is initiated, right? Something there is done in order to enter into what they call prophecy. It's not classical prophecy, obviously, but they call it prophecy. And the technique involves music. And we know from other texts, from cultures at that period, that music was practiced as a means to get into an ecstatic state. So that must have been the case there. Now these prophets, later in the Talmud, the sages call them sons of prophets. They are not the prophets that books are written about. They are not Isaiah, they are not Ezekiel, they are not Jonah, they are not Micha, they are not any of these major prophets. They are groups that would go about and enter into ecstatic trances, usually also in connection with war. They would become sort of berserk warriors charging to eradicate heresy, blasphemy, etc. Okay. Look at the second passage there. Saul comes to that hill. He engages with that group of prophets, and indeed he prophesies. And yeah, the last people said to one another, "What is this that is come onto the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets?" He seems to have the divine spirit about him. It's not like he's now going to go to reprimand the people and to tell them to behave better. That's not the type of prophet he is. He has divine spirit, and it will later help him in his first battle against the Ammonites. That doesn't really, it's not our concern. So that's the Bible. Okay, and that's like really one of the rare instances in the Bible that we see a mystical technique. But if we are looking for an actual mystical system, the first one we have in the Jewish tradition is starting around the 3rd century CE. And this is the tradition that we call the Heichalot and Merkava mysticism. Heichalot is halls in Hebrew, Merkava is chariot, but really Merkava here is more of a assembly. It is also Merkava in Hebrew, and it's a bit of a rarer word, but that's what it means. And it means basically the divine assembly, the vision of the divine sitting in his throne and encircled by angels and cherubs and other majestic celestial animals. That's basically the Merkava, the assembly. Okay? And Merkava and Echalot mysticism is about ascending in order to have a vision of the Merkava. Now here I brought you, before we get to a Echalot and Merkava text, this is from the Mishnah. I brought you this in order to understand the attitude of the sages to Merkava mysticism. And in the Mishnah, you're going to learn a bit of Jewish law, right? In the Mishnah, they say, right, one may not expound the laws of forbidden sexual relations before 3 people, students, nor the account of creation before 2, nor the divine chariot before 1, unless he is wise and understanding from his own knowledge. Don't teach Merkava at all, assembly mysticism at all, unless the single pupil that you found and may instruct is understanding from his own knowledge, something special, he knows it himself. And it says, anyone who has no consideration for the honor of his maker would be better off if he had not come into the world. Mysticism reveals the divine. Revealing the divine is a transgression into its intimacy. You are really seeing God like you perhaps should not. It's his private life. Please be considerate, be respectful. Don't do it. Okay? So this is the general law in the Mishnah. And on this background, you understand that the Merkava and Echalot people who were alive near the people who wrote the Mishnah, near the people who wrote the Talmud, were a minority group. I'm not saying they were heretics, but they were not in consensus. Now, what is Merkava mysticism? I began to say it is about ascending to the divine and having a vision of the divine. We have 2 words or concepts that we use even today from that tradition. The first is paradise. The word paradise comes from the Hebrew use of the Persian word pardes, which means garden, because you are ascending to the Garden of Eden. And today, paradise simply means heaven. The second concept we have from that tradition is the 7th heaven. I brought here a picture this is a basic illustration. It's not meant to be more than just to understand. In Merkava, we have 7 halls. In Hechalot and Merkava mysticism, we have 7 heavens which we need to ascend into. Now, this is quite not only a difficult journey, but it's quite a dangerous journey. If you want to ascend to the 7th heaven and view the divine, you need to know a bunch of secret names of the divine. And look at the text that I brought here that explains how to do it. Right? When a man seeks to journey into the chariot, the assembly, he calls on Surya, prince of the presence, and adjures him 112 times by, and this is a divine name that I even do not know how to pronounce, and if I would, I wouldn't. This is the name of the divine. Don't make any mistake. And he must be careful not to add to the 112 times and not to subtract from them. And if he adds or subtracts, his blood is on his own head. He's responsible for his own death. But his mouth must bring forth names, and the finger of his hand must count 112. At once he descends and has authority over the chariot. You need to memorize this very difficult name and recite it 112 times, not once more and not once less. You can use your finger in order to do it correctly. Obviously, I would say this is a technique that involves concentration, memory, very intense concentration, and mantra recitement, right? If you do that, at least according to Merkava and Echalot mysticism, you will abjure Surya, who is a major angel, to take you and bring you upwards to the heavens. So this is Merkava and Echalot in a very simplified form. It's a mysticism, it's a mystical tradition that a minority group of Jews used in the 3rd to the perhaps even 10th, but certainly 7th, 8th centuries CE in Babylonia, and then a bit in Europe. We have their texts that have survived until today, but really at this time there isn't any group of Jews that is engaged in such mysticism. Now the next station is Abulafian mysticism. Avraham Abulafia was a Kabbalist, at least he called himself a Kabbalist. He lived from 1240 to approximately 1290. We don't know exactly when he died. And this is exactly the time when Kabbalah comes to the surface in Europe, in the south of France, the north of Spain. This is the area in which Kabbalah is developed and begins to surface. Abulafia is not there. I will soon talk about Kabbalah, but Abulafia is something else. He is in Italy, and he actually doesn't like classical Kabbalah. He thinks classical Kabbalists get it all wrong, and he thinks his Kabbalah is the right way to do it, and he calls his Kabbalah prophetic Kabbalah, because his Kabbalah is the Kabbalah that brings you into the state of prophecy or grants you prophecy. Now, how does Abulafia do that? If you can see here, he has these sort of prayer circles or sort of meditation circles, which different letters from the Hebrew alphabet are written on, and you need to recite these letters in a certain order and in a certain speed in order to enter into a trance state in which you will be granted a vision of a figure, an angel or the figure of the divine, which will disclose before you a prophecy, a message. Now I brought here, this is a little GIF that someone made with Abulafian circles. And here is one piece of instructions by Abulafia. Right? And the matter of the letters is that they need a strong movement that will roll back and forth quickly in the place of their pronunciation. That is, that the person who words them will do so quickly in order to accustom the heart's thinking to realize his realizations. And the ear will hear and judge what the mouth words. And from all this and the like, your soul will be awakened, whether his pen, within it, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge and the fruits of wisdom, the divine spherot, until you understand the matter of above and below that are included in you. This is, I'm bringing a very short excerpt. Abulafia has 13 books that survived till today, and we know he wrote a lot more. He thought his method of meditation, of bringing a person into prophecy, is almost foolproof. Anyone can do it. And he actually wanted to teach the Pope at that time how to get to prophesy, and that way for the Pope to teach all the Christians, everybody will be prophets, and we will live in the Messianic times. It's an interesting story what happened there. He didn't get to actually meet the Pope. If he had, he would have died. Fortunately for him, the Pope died one day before he got to him. So that saved his life. But this is really only a portion. And if you can press a little button, you see Abulafia has amazing amounts of tablets with Hebrew letters, with pronunciation. These are little punctuation dots that tell you how to pronounce the exact letter. Hebrew letters that together are Hebrew names of the divine. And again, this table will demand from you not only to pronounce these letters, but also to breathe in a certain way, and also to engage in physical exercises. You need to bow down and then come up, breathe 5 times, then pronounce a letter, etc. It's complicated, but it's a very systematic method. You see here one of the rare instances in which a Jewish meditative technique before the 20th century is laid out in very minute detail. And that we have from Avraham Abulafia. Though, because he was in struggle with the classical Kabbalists, he was excommunicated, and he was influential, but perhaps not as influential as he would have been if he had kept his temper or been more moderate in what he said about them. And if you can, and just a little quote about how Abulafia, when you have worked to verify what has been taught, and the divine speech came to you and verified what the prophets have taught you, the ways of faith, and you will prophesy, and you will receive knowledge by way of prophecy of what you have heard and accepted and believed, and you will go over from faith to divine prophetic knowledge. Right? And here it's almost a modern trope, going from faith to knowledge. Don't rely on faith. I will give you the way to prophesy, and you will have divine knowledge. Now, after Abulafia, if you can press the button, we have Kabbalah. We have classical Kabbalah. Classical Kabbalah, 13th century, again, south of France, north of Spain. It's developed, but really, when you look at the pretty considerable body of texts from classical Kabbalah, you almost do not find any meditative technique. Classical Kabbalah gives Jews two major secrets. They tell Jews that the Bible, they tell Jews first that how the divine world is constructed. It is constructed from 10 sphirot, energy centers, so to speak, and they have different relationships between them. They have different characteristics. That's the first secret. Second secret, how the Bible and the body of Jewish law relate to these sphirot. When you do a certain mitzvah, a certain halachic, a certain Jewish legal activity, you are actually connecting some sphirot, connecting some energy centers, we would say today. But in all that lore, the amount of actual meditative explanations is very minute. They have some about imagining colors, but really it's you'll be hard pressed to find meditation in Kabbalah. You will find meditation specifically explained and elaborated and in center stage in, if you can press, in Lurianic Kabbalah. Lurianic Kabbalah is the next stage of Kabbalah, coming to the fore in the 16th century, this time in Sfat, in the Israeli city of Sfat. Their group of incredibly brilliant Kabbalists came together and developed what we call Lurianic Kabbalah after Yitzhak Luria, the main protagonist there. Now, as you can see from the pictures I brought here, Lurianic Kabbalah is extremely elaborate, is extremely sophisticated, and is extremely detailed. It basically takes a lifetime to learn and practice Lurianic Kabbalah. So it's really always for a very select elite. But in Lurianic Kabbalah, indeed, we have an emphasis on meditative techniques. And I want to bring two texts by Rabbi Chaim Vital, who is the main student of Yitzhak Luria, in order to understand a little bit what Lurianic Kabbalah wants from us. Can you press? So here is a text by Chaim Vital. And he explains here how to engage, what really is the purpose of your learning Lurianic Kabbalah and engaging with it. Now, I've bolded out some sentences here, and if you notice that Chaim Vital is oscillating between talking about rectifying the divine realms and inducing some sort of mystical state in himself or in the practitioner. As for engaging with the Torah itself, I've already written in Shar Ruach HaKodesh that the main purpose of a person to conduct with the Torah is that he will draw supreme realization and sanctity on himself.
It all depends on the matter whose whole intention will be to connect his soul with the roots of the Torah so that the rectification of the upper man will be complete, etc. Then tie his soil and united cleave to the upper root and aim by that the upper tree and the upper man will be completely rectified. When you rectify, when you change for the better the state of the upper worlds, you unite forces that are divided there. That's the basic idea. That's what you do. You actually also change yourself. The focus, have no mistake, the focus is on the upper worlds. You need to unite them, you need to rectify them. But when you do that, forces also descend in you, that's at least their conception, and something in you changes. I think it would be safe to say that when they practice their yichudim, and I will soon say a bit what that's all about, they actually went into trance states in which they also changed themselves inwardly. So they believed they were rectifying the upper worlds and also changing and developing themselves. Sorry. And if you can press the button. So this is an example of a meditative text, meditative explanation by Chaim Vital. What to do, and really, yeah. And here the upper yichud of Chokhmah and Binah is the name of Jehovah in Chokhmah, and then the name of Ehyeh in Binah, and when they join together like this, whatever, is the supreme copulation. And the name that connects them is the name of Jehovah filled with yuds, such as Yud, Hey, Wow, Hey, right? And numerically, this is 72, as is Hesed, which is the supreme Hesed, which merges the upper couple, which is Mazla, a word indicating some divine entity. And this is done by the soul of the tzaddik who raises above in Binah, and perhaps it is my nukbin from Binah, this is feminine waters from Binah, as we shall explain, etc., 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 right? I don't have time, of course, to go through all this, but you understand, first of all, the complexity of this. And this is just a passage. There are whole books of this. Every religious action that you do, you mentally couple, mentally connect two divine names, two divine forms, usually of the divine name, which is Jehovah in Hebrew, the four-lettered name, which is the private name of God. Just as I'm named Tomer, this is his private name. And you merge the names mentally together. That way you merge in the upper worlds the forces that need to be united. That way you rectify the upper worlds, and you yourself also perhaps are gain some spiritual advancement. It's very complex, it's extremely elaborate, and again, it's a lifetime to learn what it is done, but there we have a system of meditation that involves the whole day, every action, or at least every religious action, and is directed towards rectifying the upper world and going through a process, a spiritual process. So this is the 16th century. In the 18th century, really, and if you can press the button, we have Hasidism. Hasidism, which basically is the first modern religious awakening movement of the Jewish tradition. Hasidism initiates a revolution in the way people understand Kabbalah. Kabbalah is now for the first time not only about the upper worlds and not centrally about the upper worlds, but centrally mostly about your actual life. And the change that you need to initiate happens not in the upper worlds, of course it does also, but it happens first and foremost in your psyche, in your soul. So as a modern movement, it is more centered on the person, on people, on the inner worlds, on our feelings, on our consciousness. And this is when we have, and I brought here a quote that fleshes this out. I have heard in the name of my teacher, the teacher is the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidut, whatever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might. This is from Ecclesiastics. To combine the acts of physical to the thought, which is the unification of God, blessed be He, and the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah is the feminine aspect of God, which always needs to be unified with God. So how do you unify the different aspects of God? Not by imagining, melding together two different names of the divine as in Lurianic Kabbalah, but now simply do whatever you do consciously. Just be there. Be aware. And when you do that consciously, that is already a unification of the divine. And this is a tremendous revolution, first of all, because it really is directed towards the person, your inner life, and your inner transformation. And secondly, because it's simple. Maybe not easy, but it's simple. It doesn't require a lifelong of learning in order to understand what to do, how to engage in Jewish mysticism. Hasidism makes it a lot simpler. Just concentrate, just be aware, be mindful, etc. Now, there's a lot more to say about Hasidism, but of course, this is just a point. And now I want to, for the last really part of this lecture, to bring a Hasidic text, and then to bring two modern interpretations of it, to see the last stage, perhaps, of Jewish meditation, and what's changed between the classical Hasidic text and today's interpreters. I will bring at least one if time will allow. So the first, if you can press. The first is Rabbi Nachman of Breslev, a very famous Hasidic master today, was actually not very famous in his time, but a brilliant master. And here he talks about his hitbodedut, in Hebrew seclusion. And his hitbodedut is an hour of really meditation that he instructs all his followers to do each day. And in that hitbodedut, you need to talk with the divine, but ideally, you also need to go through a mystical experience. And here he basically lays it out, and maybe I won't read all of it, but he says, to accomplish being included in his root, that's the divine, that is, to go back and be included in the unity of God, blessed be He, who is imperative reality, that cannot be accomplished by any means other than annulment. That he nullifies himself completely until he is included in his oneness. And there is no way to accomplish annulment but through hitbodedut, because by going into hitbodedut and laying out his talk within him and his maker, through that he achieves annulment of all his lust and bad qualities until he achieves nullification of all his earthliness and be included in his root. Okay? And as you can see, this is getting more and more similar to mystical traditions that we as modern people know from the East, right? Annulment, unification, etc. And indeed, it's more similar. And Rabbi Nachman talks about, in different texts, about crying and yelling and getting yourself into an ecstatic, gushing whirlwind of emotion that you almost exasperate, almost faint, or even almost die. Thus, you annul yourself and are unified with the divine. This is Rabbi Nachman's ideal path of meditation. It's an ecstatic, emotional meditation. This, Rabbi Nachman, is the beginning of the 19th century. Now I want to bring two texts from the 20th century, even from the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, from contemporary masters. So if you can, this is the first one. This is Rabbi Erez Moshe Doron. He's a living teacher of Breslev, Nachman Breslev Hasidism in Israel. And this is one of his passages in which he describes meditation. So he says, one of the most efficient ways that Rabbi Nachman discovered for delving deep is the way of repetition. One should choose a specific Bible verse or a saying of the sages, or even his own combination of words, and repeat it again and again in intense concentration. It seems that comfortably sitting while closing the eyes is very suitable for this method. Choose one of the divine names, sit so you are comfortable, close your eyes, and call him with all the concentration you can muster, with all the honesty you can find, again and again and again, until the husk of the heart is broken and the great light of God shines and floods everything. This is a very creative interpretation of what Rabbi Nachman said. Rabbi Nachman talked about crying ecstatically. He's talking about sitting quietly with eyes closed. Rabbi Nachman talked about yelling and speaking frankly to the divine. He's talking about repetition of a word of choice, basically a mantra. And we can see here how modern interpreters of Rabbi Nachman in particular, but I can say Hasidism and even Kabbalah in general, are already incorporating into their system ideas that we find prevalent today in contemporary spirituality, in New Age circles. Mantra meditation is one, but not only that. Rabbi Nachman talked about being uplifted and united in the root, in God. United in God because you have rejected your physical essence and all your bad qualities, and you are united with God. He is talking about having the divine presence in your heart, inside. It's not the same thing. And I will bring another text from another. This is Rabbi Israel Yitzhak Bezenson, also a living teacher of Breathwork meditation today, and this will be my final point. He says, in its essence, the goal with Buddha is disconnect the consciousness, even partly from all the stimulation that pull it in different ways. Sitting quietly. I'm jumping to the end, right? At the same time, the spiritual light will shine on the complicated net of our feelings and expose the sources of wrong patterns of thought and behavior, which we were not aware that existed. And this here looks even like mindfulness meditation, because we are looking inside, we are understanding our complex nets and ties of psyche. The divine light is shining on our insides, and we are able to go through a therapeutic process and really become better. Again, this is not exactly what Rabbi Nachman taught. And this is again a sort of adoption of trends and really worldviews, I would say, that are prevalent today in contemporary spirituality circles, and incorporating them into Jewish meditation. And I can talk maybe with Jack a bit about why this is happening and what this means. And at this time, I will end my presentation. Thank you.
So thank you, Tomer. Thank you very much. So, either I have nothing to say or I just have a million questions. It's a little hard. We're talking about obviously a very rich tradition, and at the same time, if I say, well, let's talk about Buddhism and compare them, we're talking about another very rich tradition, and it's very hard to know which direction to go in. So you suggested a possibility at the end that I think I want to get to, and I should say I don't want to take too much time because I want to leave enough time for questions. But
right.
So a couple of things came to my mind. One is that the way you presented it, and it may be because you had to shorten a lot of material, it seems as though, and I think you said this, different teachers kind of said, well, I'm going to start from going to start over. I'm going to do it my way. I'm not really relying so much on the tradition. But in the sense, I assume they were all saying, well, this is what the Bible means. This is what,
Of course. Of course.
Okay.
But many times they didn't have a tradition to pick up from. Abulafia, living in Italy, he maybe have not even heard about Merkava and Heichalot mysticism. Many people, many Jews did not know that. It was a peripheral tradition. And he wanted something, and he developed something.
And so while they were doing this, while they were developing a mystical tradition, were they also, continuing with more of a ritual side of things? Were those two streams?
Okay, so great question. And as I said, almost in no time is Jewish mystical tradition and meditation contrary to the Jewish law. So either in Kabbalah and in Lurianic Kabbalah, it actually depends on the law, on religious action, on every detailed activity that the law prescribes. Or in case with Abulafia, it's not against the law, but it's also not connected to the law. I would say Abulafia continued to perform basically the mitzvot, the halachic observances that Jews did in the Middle Ages. It's not exactly what we have today, but he would do that. And on the side, practice his prophetic Kabbalah. He would probably think, though, that his prophetic Kabbalah is the most important part of his religious life, and that's already a bit of a change.
Okay. So that's something else. You've mentioned several times that the aim here was a kind of prophetic knowledge. So when I hear the word prophecy, I think of prophecies. But it seems like this is something a little broader. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, so really prophecy became a lot of different things from the Middle Ages onwards for Judaism. As I said, in the Bible already there were two types of prophecies. One is the mission certain very special people got from God to go and preach, etc., etc. The second is a type of ecstatic, sort of berserk warring in which groups would enter into some ecstatic trance. So that's already in the Bible. Then in the Middle Ages, there were many different definitions of prophecy. Maimonides, which I didn't speak at all here, talks about prophecy as simply a connection between your mind and the divine. Abulafia talks about a vision and an audial message coming to him. In Kabbalah, it will also be a little different. It will be maybe a connection with the divine Sfirot and not exactly a message that you get. So it's different things according to the different meditative paths that people would take.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So there's a term that you used that I also thought was really interesting, and you and I talked about this once a while ago, this idea of rectification.
Right.
If I understood it correctly, basically the idea is that human beings have a role to play in putting the world back together. It's kind of fallen apart, and it's up to human beings to make it right again.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And even I would say to put God back together. It really, a basic premise in Kabbalah is that something is malfunctioning with the divine. Maybe some would say not the highest, most upper, most abstract form of the divine, but any other form, any actual person or system of divine forces is malfunctioning. And it is up to the Jews, actually, to perform their observances correctly in order to rectify the divine worlds. And that's what Kabbalah, one of the secrets that Kabbalah tells you. And of course, rectifying the divine world will obviously rectify also this world and bring upon the Messianic era.
So there's always that quality, and I don't know, maybe this changes a little in the modern era, of performing these actions, as you say, to bring about the Messianic era or to heal the community, the
That's
Yeah.
right. That's a great insight. There is always the communal angle. There is always the collective angle, the angle of the people. And really, Judaism is a tradition in which a whole people get a Torah, get a mission, and it's reflected in these mystics, these different mystics' lives and teachings. It's not just to transform yourself to get into a better state of mind. It is world transformative, almost always, and it's always you're taking care of everybody, basically.
Right. So that's a point of comparison with Buddhism, it seems to me. I mean, there's so many possible points. And of course, because I know more about the Buddhist tradition than I do about the Jewish tradition, I feel I'm nervous about saying anything because whatever I say is only part of the story. But I do think that something that is very universal in the Buddhist tradition is that those people who are practicing meditation, they're kind of professionals. It's not the best way to say it, but there are people who specialize in doing this meditative practice, but they're doing it for the sake of the whole community. There's a lay community which supports them, and they in turn are carrying out a way of bringing meaning into the world that is for the benefit of everybody.
Yeah.
So that's
And of course
similar.
we have the Bodhisattva ideal, right?
Well, of course, that's a whole separate
Yeah.
point. Yes, absolutely. But there is this sense that you're acting on behalf of the community. I guess that's what I'm thinking about. And the community supports you. And I suppose that's true also. This is not so much in the mystical side or the meditative side, but there's a strong sense in Buddhism that it's kind of a quid pro quo. I don't mean to sound too contractual about it, but the monks, the meditators, do what they do, and that benefits the community, and in return, the community supports those who are doing this. And was that kind of the model too in Judaism?
Well, there is always support for those who study Torah. Even you don't need to be a mystic for it. There is an ideal for people to sit and study, and the community supports that. But certainly also great Kabbalists will be able to dedicate their whole lives to learning, to reading and writing about Kabbalah. Until today, you will have Kabbalah yeshivot, Kabbalah schools in Jerusalem, in which people basically they come in the morning, they sit and pray and read and do Kabbalah till the evening, and they're supported by the community.
So one characteristic, and I'm just jumping around a little bit because there's so much that in what you said, but one characteristic that you mentioned as, at least in the middle part of what you were saying, was this quality of the ecstatic and the a kind of emotional outburst that brings that's the heart of the meditative tradition. And so that is something that strikes me as rather different from Buddhism because there's much more of an emphasis in Buddhism on letting go of any kind of emotion. Even now, I don't want to say that too strongly because there is a sense of devotion, and fervent devotion, and I suppose that in part that's what when you talk about ecstatic union, you're talking about a devotional quality. Is that right?
Yeah, I will. But definitely the ecstasy itself, the emotional surge itself, is very important, especially in Hasidism, which views the emotional currents moving inside you as the presence of God. So if you are very much excited during prayer, that means you're close to the divine. The divine is participating in your prayer.
Right.
So it's and Rabbi Nachman, as we saw, really makes a whole thing of it. You need to be so excited that you're almost dying, and then you're annulled.
Well, it reminds me of something that someone said to me once about Jigme Lingpa, who's an important Nyingma Lama in our tradition. He said, if you're praying and your hairs don't stand on end, it doesn't count.
Yeah. Yeah.
Something like that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. So then you talked about how there was a kind of a shift, and you said, the first, and I don't remember what goes with what, because again, there was so much material, but you said there was a moment where you could say the Jewish meditative or mystical tradition enters the modern era. Yeah. And that has to do with a shift more to the personal, right?
Exactly, the personal and the internal. And really, that's two very central elements of modernity. We are individuals. We are interested in ourselves, in our autonomy, and in our inner worlds. For us, our inner worlds take on a huge meaning, which for our forefathers in medieval times did not. And Judaism is part of that. At the turn into modernity, let's say the 18th century, when Hasidism is created and is developed, it emphasizes the personal and it emphasizes the internal. Suddenly, what happens here inside or here inside becomes the most important. Yeah. And that's new for the Jewish tradition. It's not new for Eastern traditions, right? And that's not to say 2,500 years ago they were modern people, but for other reasons they took extreme interest in what's happening inside the mind. And in the West, and certainly in Judaism, we got this only in modernity. But I would say this is why today such Eastern traditions are so fascinating for us, because they had done this already for centuries, and we're just now discovering.
So a question, I think let me just ask it. One of the characteristics, people often say this, they often notice it, they say there's so many Jews who are interested in Buddhism. Yeah. What would you say about that, maybe in connection with what you've been discussing?
Yeah, exactly. So if we know that Judaism never had meditation as its central object, as its central concern, and if we know today that those of us who are interested in spiritual development, not everybody of course, but those of us who are interested in some inner transformation, that's what we picture spirituality as, and not as rectifying the upper realms. So those of us who are Jews, who are interested in spiritual transformation, development, they're not going to go to Lurianic Kabbalah and start studying that humongous body of knowledge in order, in the end, to observe all the halakha, all the Jewish law, and rectify, unify some sfirot in the upper realms. That's not what's interesting for them. What is interesting for them is inner transformation. And that you can find in the Eastern traditions. And I would say that's the most obvious answer for why there are so many Jews in those traditions. Christians have in their own tradition already an interest in the internal, an interest in the personal. First of all, redemption is personal in Christianity, right? As opposed to Judaism. Judaism sees what is the redemptive ideal in Judaism. All the Jews get to Israel, a king from the house of David, the temple, priests, sacrificing animals. That's redemption. What is redemption in Christianity? You yourself saved from internal damnation and from original sin. That's it. So the personal is already there. And in Christian mysticism, which of course we won't get into today, has this inner, personal and inward bent from the beginning. Not the same as in the East, but in Judaism there's a lack there. Right. You have something in Hasidism, and indeed Hasidism is very popular today amongst Jewish spiritual seekers. But a lot of the time, Jews will go to a tradition that offers this. And Buddhism is also easy for Jews, at least for traditional Jews to go to, because it's not polytheistic in at least outwardly, manifestly, like idolatrous.
Right.
I would say.
Okay. But it also seems to me that one of the reasons might be that I get the sense from what you're saying that even though there isn't that focus on the inner, although maybe that's coming more into it's being discussed more and practiced more, but even though that's not there, there has always been this kind of strain within Judaism of a great concern for the inner meaning of life, maybe more so than in some of the traditions. So.
Well, first of all, of course, simply many Jews thought the meaning of life was this covenant with the divine. Now, in every generation, there were also a number of Jews who were interested in spiritual development, in mystical experiences. And these were the Jews who developed all sorts of different methods. And that's, but again, this was not the main concern.
Right. So there's one thing that strikes me, and then I want to ask you one final question, and then we'll throw it open. What strikes me is that you will often hear nowadays, partly because we're here in the West, there's so many different kinds of Buddhism that have come into the West, and one of the things that is often said, it seems to me correctly, is that wherever Buddhism goes throughout Asia and now coming to the West, it always adapts itself to the situation. And what strikes me in what you're saying is that although there may not have been that kind of migration of Judaism, although on some level, of course, there has been, but there's a kind of a temporal migration that as the ethos of the time changes, Judaism changes accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, and again, Hasidism is the first very clear example of a fundamental change in the way Jews think about their tradition and what's the main concern of their tradition. And it is because, I would say, we are entering modernity. This is the 18th century, this is Europe, Eastern Europe, granted, but still affected by these developments, and Judaism changes accordingly. And we have today Orthodoxy, ultra-Orthodoxy, Reform Judaism. All these are modern expressions of the Jewish tradition. Zionism, also a modern nationalistic expression of the Jewish tradition. And then, if we take the more spiritual angle, of course, this will also will show a development according to what we have today in the world. So Jews will be spiritual in the way that is today reasonable to be.
Right.
And so 99-point-something% of them will not engage in Lurianic Kabbalah. That's not interesting for them.
Right. Okay. And maybe that's in part an answer to my final question, which was, if I remember correctly from our previous discussions, you have actually also gone on some Vipassana-style retreats.
What,
right?
me?
You, yeah?
I'm a long-time Vipassana practitioner.
Right. Okay, so why is that? What do you get out of that you don't get out of the kind of late or early 21st century Jewish meditative practice?
Well, this is the whole biographical story. I mean, I got interested in religion through Vipassana meditation. I grew up in a completely atheistic and secular family, and I went to India and just tried it out and was captivated by it, and have been a practitioner since. Now, if you ask why have I not switched to Rabbi Nachman's, yeah, because basically I think the Buddha had it pretty clear and beneficial and simple, and I've already learned this technique, and I'm doing it, and I think it does me good.
Yeah.
That's the simple answer.
Okay.
Though I am today a traditional Jew, And I do practice a lot of the tradition, even I would say meditatively. But Vipassana is still, for me, a major meditative practice.
Okay. Well, great. Let's throw it open for questions.
So where does Musar fit into this?
Shall we do the microphone thing?
Okay, so Musar, developing in the 19th century, is really not about spirituality. Developing in Europe, it's about accounting for yourself for your moral actions or your intentions and your actions. Now, it is already modern. It is very concerned. There's a lot of introspection, reflection of the individual on himself, what he does, what he's supposed to do, etc. Granted, but it's not a spiritual path. It's a path of development, but they're not engaged in contact with the divine.
Meditation is an element of it.
I would say introspection. At least I didn't find actual practices that are meant to cause some transformative change with therapeutic or soteriological. But I guess it's arguable.
So let me ask that you wait for the microphone to come to you because we're recording this and we'll post it, by the way, on YouTube.
Where's the next?
So who's, okay, over here? Okay, here and then here.
Thank you. I know that you're not able to do anything comprehensive in the amount of time, but I'm wondering in terms of the internality, even though we don't have techniques, how do you deal with the whole idea of kavanah, which is still quite an early concept, and perhaps even the Hasidim Rishonim and the Mishnah? Is that evidence that there actually were some kind of these practices that focused on consciousness and internality and the integration of practice and thought even before we got to Abulafia and beyond?
First of all, there were. I said already in the Bible there were. But let's look at kavanah. Kavanah is intention, literally, and let's see in the halakha how much are we concerned with kavanah. Praying, our sages say you should be in kavanah only in two small parts of the prayer, right? In the Shema and in the Birkat Avot.
It says you must. It says you should. You
must.
Yes.
But also this is the tradition. What is the Jewish tradition? What you must do and what you mustn't, right? If for the sages it would have been important that you be in kavanah, they would say all the prayer be in kavanah. But they didn't. Why? It wasn't that important for them. Now, again, what is kavanah for them? It's not mindfulness. Kavanah, and it's explained, it's simply knowing what you're doing. Just know what you're doing, right? Just know the actual words. You're not even concentrating on the words. It's just actually acknowledging that you're doing it. So again, is it meditation? I would be hard, I wouldn't. But I will say there are hints that there were all kinds of meditative practices. Like they say, Hasidim Rishonim, they would wait an hour before they prayed. Now you can think, what did they did? Why wait? They were contemplating something. They were preparing themselves. It's some sort of meditation. Okay, I'm not saying, but it's a hint. And when we look at the tradition itself, what it emphasizes, what it does not, we don't find it. And when you saw what I brought from the Mishnah, right? The law is don't talk about it. Don't talk about mysticism, unless, etc., etc. So I would say, I'm not saying people didn't do it. I would assume they did, but the center of the tradition, the mainstream, is not about that.
So here. You've got.
Oh. So I'm curious how you distinguish or connect between two sets of terms. One is prayer and meditation. How do they relate to each other? And do you distinguish spirituality from mysticism?
Okay. Well, the second couple is just, it's both are modern concepts, and that I don't, we can do whatever we want with them. I mean, I can't explain what I mean, but
It's not about explain. It's do you distinguish them?
yeah, I do. Mysticism, yeah, but let's not go into it. It's just, but prayer and meditation in Judaism, I think that's an important thing to notice. According to halakha, you must pray, but must you concentrate during prayer? Must you be aware of your prayer? Again, except for two little parts, no. You can think about your business tomorrow. You can think about what you forgot to do yesterday. No problem. According to halakha, no problem. You are exempt from prayer if you did it in that way. Now, take the mystical traditions in Judaism, like Kabbalah. Kabbalah will lay extreme emphasis on prayer, and Hasidism, right? And say during prayer, that's the time, or that's one of the peak times in which you unify the upper realms, and here is how to do it. And then prayer becomes a very important and lengthy activity which you do. It takes a lot of your day, and you, again, during prayer, you unify and rectify the upper worlds. Okay? But again, that's the mystical tradition, which is not the basic way Jews pray.
Can you speak about enlightenment within Jewish mysticism? So there's the brief mentions of unification or ascending to the divine throne or to God, but there isn't this sort of pursuit of permanent connection that you have in Buddhism and other Eastern traditions. So what can you say about that?
So when we get to Hasidism, we already have talk, it's rare, but we have talk about annulment of the self and unification with the divine. And we have that in Rabbi Nachman, and we have that even more prominently in Chabad Hasidism. Chabad, which you see everywhere, though today they're not very into it, but you have a very impressive, non-dual, I would even say, mystical lore in Chabad. It's very elaborate and brilliant, I would say. And there you will have explicit talk about actually realizing that there is no you, there is no ego, there is no self, and everything is the divine. And that, I would say, is the closest you would get before the 20th century, when you have other influences, etc., very abound. The closest you would get to actual talk about a permanent transformation in your mind.
Hi. So, as a side point, I just want to mention that V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha, that you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, seems a little bit like involving one's consciousness as and not simply doing some other external mitzvah. It seems as if that is a call to something deeper than do something by rote activity. But that's not my main thing I want to say. The main thing I wanted to say is, you pointed out in your talk that there was a steep sense of something being wrong in the world and something being wrong consequently in oneself. I wonder if you'd consider the possibility that the meditative tradition in Judaism, perhaps in other spiritual traditions as well, is a reaction to the experience of being unable to individually or possibly collectively making a tikkun olam, of making a transformation of the world, that then leads us to say, well, I can't do it in the large world. I can do it myself, possibly in my community, possibly through this. And I think of all of the young men in the army in Israel who go to India after, out of a sense that they've experienced something that's really fundamentally wrong in that society. And they have no discourse way of understanding or talking about it, certainly not within the religious world there. And so they find a path that is a way of soothing the pain that people have for not being able to, or at least believing that they cannot, fix the larger world and fix themselves in that process. And so we'll go to, okay, maybe I can fix myself and give up on the larger transformation. So I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think there is truth in what you're saying. There is a point there. I mean, in order to find suffering in Jewish life, you don't need to go to the soldiers today. There was suffering, a long history, most of the time, let's say. And Gershom Scholem, the foremost researcher of Jewish mysticism, had a whole theory about how Lurianic Kabbalah was a reaction to the expulsion of Jews from Spain, 1492. So it's there all the time. This reaction to the state of affairs, which is not the best, to say the least, right? And well, now and also in India, by the way, I think there is a sound theory about the Upanishads being written on the background of the promises of the Vedas, or the assumption of the Vedas coming into crisis. We can't really control nature and God. Thus, let's turn inside and disconnect or transform ourselves. And yeah, I think that's always there. But I wouldn't say that's the only explanation. I mean, and in Kabbalah, we need to remember that there was always, and in Hasidism also, always also the communal aspect of things. We need to rectify ourselves, but also, and sometimes first and foremost, we need to rectify the universe.
Okay, one last question.
Do you think that there might be any connection between the spread of the printing press and people being able to have this individual reading experience with Hasidism? Because about that time, the printing press was, and suddenly people could have it in their own hands.
That's a good theory, but I actually don't think that's what happened. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, barely wrote. And in East Europe, these people were very poor, and I don't think that what aided them was the spread, the physical, literary spread of ideas. I think it was more word to mouth. Word.
Okay, we'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you everybody for coming. It's a very learned audience. Good questions. I hope we see you again.